importance to the community in Horizon City. So I hope that my enthusiasm comes through, even though we're visiting virtually. So if Rafa, if we could go to the next slide. I know that capture value has been the theme for this session, and so I just want to go over some very brief background for transportation reinvestment zones. They capture the revenue stream created by the increase in the property valuation that is specifically related to transportation improvements. That is the difference between the TRZs and tax increment reinvestment zones, TIRZs, which, by the way, Horizon City is in the midst of also creating for a different type of project that they have in their comprehensive plan.
Terry?
Yes, sir.
Just to give you a little bit of background so you know your audience, yes. We have a few TRZs, TIRZs.
Okay.
And so we're familiar with TRZs, and actually, if you ever need any help, you know, we're happy to help you with the process that we've gotten along and through. We have never had a TRZ, although we've talked about it several times, about having a TRZ, a Transportation Reinvestment Zone.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but there are multiple people here who are actually who've served on the TRZ board and participated in that. But we are very much looking at TRZs, TRZs.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. TRZs are created primarily along transportation corridors, again, because the focus is on those transportation improvements and the increase in valuation that the transportation improvements will foster. And they were authorized by the state legislature in 2000 at the 2007 legislative session, and some modifications to that enabling legislation made in 2011. So they were tweaked a little bit to make it, from my perspective, easier for municipalities to implement. Can we go to the next slide? For Horizon City, the TRZ resulted from a comprehensive mobility plan. And as Rafa read in my bio, the TRZs with which I have experience have resulted from multi-jurisdictional comprehensive plans that were really initiated by the MPO and TxDOT in our region. TTI conducted the financial analyses for the zones within the different jurisdictions, and because they were part of this comprehensive mobility plan, they were endorsed by all of the participating agencies. So all of the jurisdictions committed to funding projects with multiple funding sources, to include federal funding sources, state funding sources, local funding sources. They were looking at multimodalities in the transportation projects. And so it became an initiative for the region as a whole, as opposed to just being one single entity trying to move a project forward. And I think that's really important as entities start looking at multiple funding sources and at projects that might fit into a TRZ model, that having multiple champions and having those projects recognized as priorities for the region helps to move the entire initiative forward. Next slide, please. So here's some information about Horizon City in particular. It's just under 20,000 in population. We expect that after the census, it will exceed 20,000. It is one of the fastest growing communities in El Paso County. Just to give you an idea of its operating budget for fiscal year 2021, the general fund budget is just under $11 million. So the capital improvement programs that the town committed to and that they participated in as far as the comprehensive mobility plans were really huge in comparison to what they were used to dealing with as far as the day-to-day operations. Their first adopted capital improvement program was in fiscal year 2014, and it included $15 million of infrastructure projects. $15 million were certificates of obligation that the town issued. In 2018, they adopted another $13 million for parks and recreation facilities. And their current capital improvement program is estimated at just under $118 million. But most of those projects are unfunded. However, they've understood that making sure that they have identified priorities and estimated some of the projects that are regionally significant is important in being very effective contributors to the MPO and agencies that can then become competitive whenever funding opportunities become available.
Terry, question on that, if you don't mind.
Yes, sir.
Jump in with questions?
Sure.
Okay, great. So when you say that the projects are prioritized in your capital improvement program, is it just a list and higher on the list means more important, or is it really been thought through in terms of years and this project can't go until this one is completed? I mean, when you say prioritized, what do you mean? Because we're in a situation right now where we have a capital improvement program where it's basically just a list. It's not even prioritized. It's just a list of projects we want to do, like yours, mostly unfunded, and actually almost all unfunded. But we're talking about the prioritizing them. I'm just curious what if it is truly prioritized, how you're doing that.
There have been several levels of prioritization. I'd love to say that there was one specific system that the town followed, but that has not been the case. The very first prioritization, that was a 2014 CIP, was infrastructure. And what the town had very specifically identified as a policy priority is that they wanted to look at street and drainage infrastructure. And so they consulted with their public works director, with their town engineer. That's when they brought me on board as a capital improvement program manager. And we looked at the projects that would have the most impact and would ideally support the tax base. So for example, the flagship project in 2014 was street and drainage improvements at the industrial park. So there was that level of prioritization. And then the next level of prioritization was recreation and a new city hall, simply because they've been outgrowing their administrative facilities. And they knew that the next step after infrastructure is that they needed to provide some quality of life improvements. So it was more policy driven than specific metrics for the projects. The rest, the unfunded projects in the CIP, are prioritized primarily by funding source. So the projects that have been submitted to the MPO for inclusion in the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, the long-term plan, those are the next priorities, and those have been programmed for specific years, again, based on the regional significance and the significance to the community specifically. But then the rest of the projects are more of a listing of needs rather than a specific prioritization. So I think that specifically answers the question that you had, but it's several tiers of prioritization.
But there's no ordinance or policy that require like a hard prioritization that says you can't begin this project until this one is complete, like this comes first, this has to come first, kind of thing. Nothing like that.
The only policy document that directs that is the annual resolution that adopts the CIP, and that focuses on the funded projects, indicating that those that were presented as part of the program that are funded have to be completed before anything else is funded with those monies. And there is an order of prioritization. You know, there is one of the elements is if there are opportunities to leverage funding, then that's one of the considerations that the council can take. But the focus is let's build what we have promise we're going to build, and then we'll go to additional projects that are of a similar nature. And then the last priority is that we would then, if there's funding that's left over that cannot be programmed, then it would go to reduce the debt.
Thank you, Terry.
Sure. Okay, if we could move to the next slide, please. So I mentioned the 2013 comprehensive plan, and the specific project that is funded with TRZ was included in the county's comprehensive mobility plan. The County of El Paso was the lead agency for this, primarily because they were funding a number of the projects with vehicle registration fees, which they had adopted. So you can see the 16 projects that were listed. They were throughout the county. Some of them were in the city of El Paso proper, others in unincorporated areas of the county, and others in some of the smaller communities like the city of Socorro and the town of Horizon City.
So the comprehensive mobility plan you're speaking about was the MPO's plan, and Horizon City participated in that plan.
Exactly. Yes,
and it was specifically about deciding where to direct one type of funding, the funds collected from vehicle registration fees, or it was more than that.
It was more than that, because the way that the plan was developed, it was the county recognizing that they needed to make infrastructure and transportation improvements throughout the county, and they knew that they would have to use vehicle registration fees. They knew that they would have to utilize the Camino Real Regional Mobility Authority because of the vehicle registration fees. So they needed to have the RMA as the implementing agency. But because there were also other funding sources that were incorporated into the plan, to include the traditional STP and CMAQ funds, it went through the MPO. And so TTI was a critical participant in developing the plan and identifying multiple funding sources. As has happened with other comprehensive mobility plans that have been adopted in El Paso County, the plan is a starting point, and then it starts changing, because as funding opportunities become available, and because these projects become the priorities for the region, they are being developed, and they tend to be shovel ready. So when a funding opportunity becomes available, there's the opportunity to substitute funds and get those more restrictive funds that need to be spent quicker on the comprehensive mobility plan projects. And then that frees up some other funding sources, and other projects may become more viable at that point. So it truly is a plan with a lot of moving pieces. And that's one of the reasons that it requires the collaboration and cooperation of the MPO and all of your jurisdictions, because there's quite a bit of horse trading that happens to get these projects, which have again been identified as the priority projects, to get them moving and to get them completed. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Excuse me, next slide, please. So the 2013 Comprehensive Mobility Plan had a number of funding sources, as I indicated: Texas Mobility Funds, vehicle registration fees, the transportation reinvestment zones for Horizon City and for the town of Socorro, and federal funds to include STP funds.
Why were TRZs why only a couple places for the TRZs? Why not more? Why was that more widely utilized?
The city of El Paso already had implemented a couple of TRZs that were applicable to the projects from a previous comprehensive mobility plan. Initially, the county was established a TRZ However, they were advised from the legal perspective that they could not divert general fund into a TRZ because there's a constitutional prohibition for designated use of general fund monies. So they had to back away from the transportation reinvestment zone, and the TRZs were then only implemented by the 2 municipalities that could implement them and that had projects that fit that corridor and that had been analyzed as part of the overall plan. Next slide, please. So you'll notice that I say the Horizon City adopted a revised TRZ in 2014. That's because the first TRZ, and this is a lesson learned, the first TRZ had a couple of issues with it that were discovered in 2014. So the first one was adopted in 2013, but the town had advertised it in a newspaper that was more prevalent in the community as opposed to a newspaper of general circulation as a state statute. So to avoid any problem with a notification that had been done, they reestablished it in 2014. And the second issue is that one of the properties that was initially in the TRZ was privately owned, and it's a golf course. Between 2013 and 2014, the Horizon Regional Municipal Utility District, which provides water and wastewater services to the Horizon community, purchased the golf course. So the golf course went from private ownership to public ownership, which doesn't usually happen with TRZs. It was one of those situations that was unique to Horizon City, and so Horizon City had to deal with that, and they had to review the revenues that were projected for the TRZ given that change in ownership. The TRZ, and again we're looking at the financial the TTI completed, was projected to generate approximately $6 million for that single project, the East Lake Extension Phase 2. The reason that this is considered Phase 2 is Phase 1 is in the county, entirely in the county. So we had to separate based on jurisdictions, even though the roadway is a single road, and to the traveling public, it's one project that's been going on for a number of years now. That we did separate it based on jurisdictions. And
so the East Lake Extension, is there, do you have that on a map somewhere where, yes. Is this the main?
Yes, yes, we will see the extension because it was a new roadway location.
Is that East Lake Boulevard? Is that what it's called? On the, because I'm just looking on a map of on Google Maps.
Yes, East Lake Boulevard. That's exactly right.
Okay.
So the project was completed in April 2018, ahead of schedule and under budget. Just to cut to the bottom line. Next slide, please. So here you see the corridor. You'll notice that there are very large parcels of land that were undeveloped at the time of the TRZ analysis. East Lake was built to about that section that you see north, Landis Curly, where you see that. So that part of it was a bit of a reconstruction. And then the rest of it, to include the curve that goes back down to Horizon Boulevard, that was all new construction. So this meant that the roadway was going to open up brand new areas that would not otherwise have had a major roadway going through it. The total acreage, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You're creating a lot of value.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons that this was a good candidate for TRZ, because we were opening up this vacant land by building this major corridor that connected. East Lake goes down to I-10, and then by coming back and connecting to Horizon Boulevard, that provides yet another connection to I-10. Horizon State doesn't have any frontage on I-10, so getting traffic to I-10 is of paramount importance.
Can I ask a question, comment to really highlight that point? So a TRZ is not a great tool for redevelopment. Well, I guess, I mean, that could be argued, but it's really something about opening up new areas. Is that what you would, in other words, if we had we have Mines Road, it's existing, a lot of existing development already there, and fixing the congestion problem there may not really increase property values, although it would solve a big problem, but there may not be that value to capture, versus here where you've got property values that are relatively low. You bring in a new arterial, and all of a sudden this is, much more valuable land. And so that's why you're saying a TRZ works really well here, because it's going to be it's capturing its value based on property values. That's how it's collecting. It's collecting off of property value. So if you're increasing them by adding a new road where there wasn't one before, now you're really increasing property values. You're going to bring a lot of money into the TRZ. Is that right?
That's exactly right, because we're opening this up and building a roadway that would otherwise have been built in bits and pieces as occurred organically. The connection would not have been there, but now we have that connection so that the developers can see the traffic, can see the value to the land. One of the things that the town is doing is encouraging the property owners, the landowners, and the developers to look at this as an opportunity for different kinds of development. And we're pushing for them to have a little bit more commercial and office development than they normally would. In other sections of East Lake Boulevard, it's about a 30% commercial development. And so what the town is trying to do through its comprehensive plan and through its planning department and working closely with property owners is to see what kind of value we can continue adding to the entire corridor, because we want to get that value built sooner rather than later, and we want it to be a comprehensive type of development as well. But you're absolutely right that the greatest value here is that it was vacant land, and now it's going to be developed. We expect at a faster rate than would have happened organically, and that's the increase to the TRZ that's going to help down its commitment to the county and to the RMA. So the initial estimate for the TRZ was 30 years, and the total acreage for the zone is about 1,700 acres. So this is a large TRZ, even though it is along the corridor, but because the properties were so large and had not been subdivided, it gave us a large area for the TRZ.
Barry, can I ask a few more questions?
Of course.
You sure don't mind me jumping in?
Of course not. No.
And jumping around, because maybe you're going to get to this. But first question, just curious. I look at a larger area map of what's outside of Horizon City, and I can't help but notice just all those platted streets, all those paper streets to the east of Horizon City. What's the story there? I mean, that's rare to see that. I mean, it's pretty incredible, the extent of those platted paper streets where there's just no development.
Yes.
So I don't know probably most people aren't looking at a Google map like I am, but if you just look at this map and you can see to the northeast or to the right of Horizon City, the colored area, there's all those, it looks like a residential subdivision streets. There's nothing there. Those are just streets. And out even more, it's like 10 times, well, I don't know about 10, but it's like 5 times the size of Horizon City to the east in just platted streets with no development. So it's really curious thing. What's the story there?
The story there is that we have fractured ownership in thousands of acres, and the TRZ that the town is implementing now is meant to deal with a similar situation that's right in the geographic center of town. And what we mean by fractured ownership is that these subdivisions, if you want to call them that, I'll use that term loosely, were platted, were subdivided without any infrastructure. So there are no streets other than the platted streets. There is no infrastructure. There is no utility, no water, no wastewater, no other utilities. So it is very difficult for those parcels to become developed because state statute prohibits the selling of those parcels and any residential building until the infrastructure is brought into place. So unless you have an investor who is willing to take on the risk of tracking down these individual property owners and assembling an adequately sized subdivision, those aren't going to develop. And that's what makes some of this development within Horizon City, where we do have a home rule city, where we do have planning opportunities, that's what makes it valuable to those property owners, is that even though there's a great deal of land, it's not particularly developable land because the costs to develop are so prohibitive for smaller developers or for even individual property owners.
Was this somebody's get-rich-quick scheme, like in the 80s or something? Do they just?
It goes back beyond that, probably to the 50s and 60s. So yeah, that was it. You know, it's basically a colonia by another name, right? Because they have been sold to individual property owners, and you know, many of those individual property owners have passed. So now whoever is trying to assemble parcels has to deal with heirs. Which could be missing heirs. I mean, you can just imagine how the complications start multiplying because of the situation.
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is, so if you're looking at this map, the blue is, well, so the colored area is the city limits of Horizon City. The blue is what's in the TRZ, the TRZ.
Right.
The pink is what's outside of the TRZ. So the property value that you capture, the increment that you're capturing to fund this infrastructure project is coming from the blue area. So obviously it's not picking up what's in the county or what's, maybe that's another jurisdiction.
Correct, yes.
And that's because the entity, the municipality, can you have, well, I guess the question I'm getting at is, let's say we know the city's going to grow to an area, and you know, for us, the example of where this could work would be our outer loop. But right now, the outer loop is not in, it's in our ETJ, but it's not in our city limits. So would we have to incorporate that first and annex it and then set up a TRZ, or is there something you'd work with the county and the city on? Can TRZs be multi-jurisdictional? Or does it have to be one jurisdiction and you can only capture the value from that one jurisdiction's taxes? Or can multiple participate?
I don't know the answer to that. Initially, the CMP and these projects, East Lake Phase 1 and Phase 2, were designed with just that in mind, that it would be multi-jurisdictional and overlapping TRZs, the one for the municipality and one for the county. But as I indicated, the county received legal advice that they could not participate in a TRZ. So if the county cannot participate, pardon me?
What was the reason again? The county thought they couldn't participate?
Because there is a constitutional prohibition to diverting general taxes away from the general fund. Property taxes, diverting property taxes from the general fund for any purpose.
That's what the city's doing.
Pardon me?
But that's what the city's doing.
Yes, that's how the TRZ is interpreted, as
okay,
diverting.
You're saying that your county just doesn't want to participate. on like constitutional grounds is saying no to participating in TRZs, and I would assume TIRZs as well. They don't believe in tax increment financing.
They have participated in TIRZs with the city.
But they see TRZs differently, TRZs differently.
That's the advice that they received, right?
Well, that's weird. Strange.
Well, what can I tell you? That was something that we were faced with because we were in the midst of, the town had created its TRZ and was getting ready to negotiate the 3-party agreement with the county and the RMA, and that's when the county said, we'd love to have a TRZ, but we're being advised that we can't. But again, they certainly made whole on the project with vehicle registration fees. So the project and the program as a whole did not suffer because the county still kept its commitment to fund with local funds. So I don't want to paint the county as someone who backed off from the comprehensive plan, because that's not at all what happened. It was just a matter of switching out the funding source.
Got it.
So to the next slide, because I think this is going to bring together a lot of what we've been discussing, and that's the zone size, the impact on the general fund, the term, the funding mechanism, and the zone description. All of these elements are interrelated, and for the town, the zone size had an area that included from the center line of the transportation corridor selected. So you saw that was a half mile. So if there were any properties that were in that half mile, they became part of the zone. Let me see. The impact on the general fund is a critical element for any municipality to consider, because the TRZ sets aside the growth from that development. And many municipalities may rely on that growth to fund the increased services like police, fire, parks, anything that really the general fund is funding. So calibrating the zone size to ensure the financial feasibility and the projects while balancing the additional demands of the growth is critical, right? That's something that your financial team needs to be taking a look at, because remember that you don't have to dedicate 100% of the increment to the zone and to the projects. It could be any amount from 0 to 100, or from 1% to 100%, right? So again, that calibration has to take place to determine how the project will ultimately be funded. The term is tied with the size and impact, because that determines how much you're going to be generating as far as the increment, and how much you can dedicate to the zone, or how much you want to reserve or keep for the general fund. Again, for Horizon City, it was a 30-year term. Yes.
Well, maybe you're getting to it with the zone description, but I see on East Lake Boulevard that, and maybe you were getting at this earlier when you said, what are other ways we can add value? I'm seeing that you have a separated, looks like a multi-use path on
Yes.
both sides. So TRZ funds can be used for active transportation, for walk, pedestrian facilities, bicycle facilities, transit facilities.
Mm-hmm. Correct. As long as it's a transportation project as defined in statute, then the TRZ can fund it. Oh, so yes, the multi-use path was part of the overall project estimate, and it's being funded with the TRZ as well.
Have you heard of a TRZ in Texas or elsewhere that was used exclusively for an active transportation project, for a bicycle, for a multi-use path? Or I guess they can blur the line between recreation and transportation, but Have you heard about any, something that wasn't auto, but it was maybe just transit or just bicycle or just?
Usually what I have been familiar with are zones that if they have transit or they have active transportation, it's part of the multimodal system. So it's not, I don't know of any zone, and Rafa may have a better sense for this, but I don't know of any zone that excludes auto. I think that's the best way of putting it. I think they include other modes, but I don't know of anyone that specifically excludes auto.
One thing
that has included only pedestrian or only transit. In Houston, they were looking at one for transit to help pay for light rail train stations.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking about here. One idea that pops into my mind as a potential TRZ project would be the value that we could capture from doing like a bus rapid transit line along a commercial corridor that needs reinvestment. If we had a TRZ in place that funded that and then captured the value from the increased density that we could get over, over the years, that something, but that wouldn't, it would be just transit.
Well, and the city of El Paso included in its TRZs their rapid transit corridors. So if you'll notice the city's TRZs, they include state highways because that's where the primary spokes and corridors for bus rapid transit would be. They have funded the street improvements, roadway improvements, as well as the rapid transit stops through the TRZ and through a mix of funding categories. So I suppose I need to correct myself and say that there are some, but the overall program for the city included both transit, pedestrian amenities, and roadway amenities as well. But I think if you define it, if you can define the project, right, to demonstrate how it will add value to the corridor, to the zone, then that's where the financial feasibility analysis comes in. And as you indicated, with a bus rapid transit route and those amenities, maybe the first and last mile type of amenities as well, you can start demonstrating how that's going to change perhaps some of the zoning and some of the densities and some of the property taxes that you're going to generate. And you could also demonstrate that it might also increase other types of revenues, like sales tax revenues that don't necessarily have to go into the zone, but that also support the growth that you're trying to foster within the zone. The last point that I wanted to talk about as far as the funding mechanism, because a zone will generate funds over a period of time, but you need cash flow sooner rather than later, you usually have to have some sort of debt instrument, because a pay-as-you-go is not necessarily going to be the way to foster the development. In our case, again, the vehicle registration funds were the cash infusion that the project needed, and so now the town is paying those back to the RMA and to the county. But that is something that needs to be considered along with the rest of the financial analysis of the TRZ. The zone can be described in a couple of ways and could be meets and bounds, but we have used the property ID numbers simply because it's easier with our central appraisal district to have that overlay, and also to track any subdivision that happens to some of those initial property ID numbers as they're subdivided. And so they continue being in the footprint, and they continue being captured by the CAT when they make their calculations and forward them to our town's financial advisor. You see, I see a question. To what extent are economic development corporations providing data to support these TRZ proposals, or to what extent are they involved? It's a great question. Horizon City happens to have an economic development corporation. At the time, they were not an active participant. They weren't particularly active at the time. So they did not become a player as these decisions were being made. The decisions were being made mostly by the council and the mayor. And that is something else that has to be balanced, because there may be some property tax abatements that your economic development corporation may want to make. So you certainly want to make sure that you're working hand in glove with them. If you're looking at redevelopment or areas where your economic development corporation may have plans already, because you can make arrangements with them, and you can exclude certain properties from the zone if you want to use the property taxes and the increment for a different purpose. And certainly they can support the way that development occurs along these corridors, again, to increase that tax base and to increase the increment that's going into the fund.
Terry, that question reminded me of something I wanted to bring up. Let me share a scenario with you that happened here and get your thoughts, get your advice. So one of the TRZs, the proposals, rough proposals that we had is we had a developer approach us about creating a TRZ to basically fund the infrastructure that primarily that developer would have for anyway. It was a way for that developer, to basically decrease the cost of his development and pass that cost on to future property owners who would purchase in that development. It was an industrial development, business park, industrial park development. And as staff, we advised against that, because what we said is, well, if this really shouldn't be a replacement tool for infrastructure that they'd be required to build anyway and just passing it on. It should be about you're adding additional value that wouldn't have otherwise been there. You're adding additional investment to the infrastructure that you otherwise don't have a way to create or a good funding source for. But the line can kind of get gray, I think, for some people. In other words, are you creating a TRZ to build infrastructure that you otherwise wouldn't have funding for, and that we really need this, or and it does create benefit and you're capturing the benefit, or are you creating a TRZ to make a project cheaper, in other words, more profitable for the developer, so they can pass on the cost of that to the future property owners who will buy and then have to, they'll be funding that with an increment, the infrastructure built. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the bottom line is that you need to evaluate the increment that is being accrued to the jurisdiction, and find out if there are impediments to the development. And you're right, this is a balance and a judgment call, right? Are you just making it easier for the developer, or are you really addressing defects in the planning? Are you addressing defects in the situation, or unique circumstances in the situation that prevents your jurisdiction from developing the area to its best and highest potential, or in a way that is in accordance with your comprehensive plan or with the community's vision?
I think that's a key right there, because the reason this Matt Miller's question sparked my remembering of this is because, if you're in economic development and developer comes to you and says, hey, we're going to do this really great project, but, you know, we want to do a TRZ so that we can pay for it and make it happen. And, you know, you're excited, so you're going to bring that to the city and bring that to, you know, everybody that's interested, because you want to see that project come to fruition. But as staff in other departments, we might be a little more skeptical and say, well, wait a second, would this project not otherwise happen if it wasn't for the TRZ?
Right.
Or would it happen? It would happen anyway. We're just making the project, you know, we're making it cheaper to build, and in other words, more profitable. So, like that point that you just made, where would a road otherwise not get built, except if it wasn't for this TRZ that we could bond against and get some funds in, and then all of a sudden we're fixing a problem rather than, you know.
Right, and the timing of it is also important, right? So if the developer is required to build a roadway, for example, but it's going to take 20 years, is that something that matches, again, with the community's plans, with the community's vision, right? And you know, I had someone once tell me, oh yes, that's a benevolent developer, right, trying to get his hand into the public till. And I've never forgotten that phrase. But the fact of the matter is that you have to have relationships with your developers, because they're not going to go away. The ones who know how to do it right aren't going to go away, and neither is the municipality. So if you can find ways to form partnerships that work for both, and you know, as a municipal individual, as someone who has that responsibility to our policymakers, is it something that makes sense for the municipality, right? Or is it just something that makes business sense for the developer? So it is a judgment call, I think.
Is there a requirement with TRZs that, I think you mentioned, you spoke to this earlier, that there's a planning component, so that you're not using this for collectors, and, you know, you're not using this for internal projects in a development, but you're really looking at projects that have been planned and are, you know, are regional in effect? And is there any requirement like that that speaks to the scale or the planning that's gone into a road or a transportation project? So in other words, you don't just get, oh wow, we did a TRZ and someone else like, hey, I want to do a TRZ over here and you know, decrease the cost of my project, and hey, I want to do one over here.
I'd have to research that a little bit. My recollection is that when you're funding TRZs, when you're creating TRZs, the transportation projects have to fit a specific definition. And I want to say that it harkens back to the federal definition of regionally significant transportation projects. But don't quote me on that. That's just my recollection at this point. There's also a pragmatic aspect of it, right? If you're going through the process of doing the financial analysis to determine what the increase is going to be, because you need to figure out whether or not your TRZ is going to be able to fund your project. You know, if you're doing just a small project or something that's going to reduce development costs, that may not necessarily generate the increment that you need to fund the debt or fund the project. So again, that's why all of these elements start fitting in as far as the size, the term, how you're planning to finance the project, the funding mechanism. Because if it's something that's really small, it may not generate the increment that you need to fund it, to fund the project. Does that make sense?
And
yeah.
The law doesn't have any, you know, it defines TRCs. You can use TRCs for any transportation project according to the definition of the state code, and it's a very broad definition. I think where you look at it, like Terry was saying, is when you look at the economics of the project. Does the project develop enough that you can capture the revenue that you need to pay for those improvements, as well as additional revenue that you were already expecting in any case. And so it's also, if depending on the financing you're going to use. If you're using state infrastructure bank fund, well, that limits you to state highway roadways. So those are some of the considerations. I think for a development like the case you were discussing, Kirby, that may be working, or may work better as a tax increment reinvestment zone, where there is also an agreement with the developer to repay the loan, for example, if by certain time some development milestones are not met. That's done in other places.
Thanks, Rafa. And Terry, just you know, we got 30 more minutes. Not that you have to use all that time, but just so you know, we're at with timing, so you're not. Don't worry about feeling rushed. We got plenty of time.
Oh, but, okay. I wanted to be respectful of everybody's time. So the rest is probably less dense than what we've covered so far. So I think we can go through it quickly and still allow time for questions.
Well, I wanted to provide a quick update. Our city attorney sent over the definition of what you're referring to. So with the county of El Paso not being able to participate, apparently it's based on the state's constitution, actually restricts counties from forming TRZs, and there's probably some uncertainty of whether they can actually participate in a TRZ or a TRZ or anything that's reinvestment zone related, or reinvestment zone related. So they can't form them. They definitely can't do that. There's a question of whether or not they can participate, and probably just being on the side of safety, they decided not to participate. So that makes sense. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Benavidez, for sending that over. That's much appreciated.
Yes, thank you. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. So the funding mechanism for East Lake, a three-party agreement that relied exclusively on the local entities, Horizon City, the county, and the Camino Real Regional Mobility Authority. The town established the TRZ and contributed funds to the RMA and was responsible for all of the right-of-way acquisition for the project. The county funded the gap between the project budget and the town's projected TRZ revenues through the vehicle registration fees. But what they actually did is that they upfronted all of the costs, and now the town is reimbursing the county through the Camino Real Regional Mobility Authority. The RMA issued bonds utilizing the vehicle registration fees and managed the project design and construction. So each one of us had very specific duties, and the relationship continues because we continue paying through the RMA for the town's portion of the project. The agreement provisions are on the next slide. The RMA was the clearinghouse. We used them as the project manager for the entire project. Initially, we had thought about using state infrastructure bank loans, but decided not to, so as to not federalize the project. And the RMA issued the bonds that pledged the vehicle registration fees for their repayment. And as I indicated, then the TRZ reimburses that portion of the vehicle registration funds. The project schedule on the next slide you'll see is pretty aggressive. In December 2014, the town adopted TRZ number 2. Again, it was the same basic principle of TRZ number 1, but because we had to rescind number 1, we had to name this one number 2. In July of 2015, the RMA awarded the design contract, and a year later, bids were opened. You'll notice it took us a longer time to execute all of the three-party agreements. It took us until November of 2016, just before the construction began in January of 2017. And then in April of 2018, we had the ribbon cutting, and we were driving vehicles, and people were walking down the walking path. The town accepted the project for maintenance, and then in May of 2020, so just this year, the city made its first payment to the RMA. There was an understanding in the agreement, and part of the benefit of having this three-party agreement, we had a patient lender, basically, who understood that it would take some time for the increment to happen and for the town to begin collecting on that. So we built that into the agreement so that the first payment wouldn't occur until this year. The next few slides show you the cross-section for the roadway. So you can see the divided raised median roadway with 3 lanes on either side and a shared bike path also on both sides, which is used very heavily when we had to start shutting things down for COVID-19. That's probably one of the biggest complaints that the town received, that they wanted the residents were so used to using that walking path that they really wanted to make sure it was still open for the public to be able to walk, mostly in the evenings. You'll see the next slide again shows the alignment of the roadway, some of the treatments as far as the walking path and the median. Then the next slide shows you some of the pictures, and you'll see that this still looks like pretty vacant land. These were taken shortly after the construction was completed. More pictures are on the next slide. We do have some rain in West Texas. It happens maybe 2 or 3 days out of the year, but we thought we wanted to show that to the rest of the state. And you'll see on the left that that's the walking path separated from the roadway. And then the final few slides are the project financials. This was the estimated amount. It was $19 million. You'll notice that the county did more than 3/4 of, and the city's portion was about 23%. So this is how it was going to wind up being, with the county portion at about 14.8 million and the city at about 4.3 million. The next slide shows the actual amount, which is the debt that is now being paid. It was under budget, so the total project is just under 17 million. The town share became just under 3.8 million. And so we had a savings on the next slide, about 2.3 million. The city saved about $500,000 after all was said and done. You'll go to the next slide, please, Rafa. You'll see that we began, as I indicated, making payments in May. The final payment is scheduled for May of 2038, and we have graduated payments going from 29,000 in May to 842,000 in May of 2038. You'll see the performance as it's limited at this point. The taxable value in 2014 was $16.6 million. As of 2020, it's 24.7 million. In FY 2020, the revenue was 99,000. So even though the payment was only required to be 29,000, the city paid 99,000. And I apologize, I have a typo. The projected revenues for 2021 is 149,000, even though the required payment is 89,000. So at this point, the town is enjoying good growth in the TRZ, and it's making those payments. It's just paying 100% of what it is collecting in the increment fund. because there is no penalty for early payment to the RMA. So we want to make sure that as the town receives that increment, it goes ahead and satisfies its debt.
Ms. Quezada?
Yes.
On this, I'm just curious, maybe you haven't, because I know it's really hard to do, but have you ever tried to quantify, maybe in a presentation to your council or your staff there, the value that the projected value, just because property values in the county on average have increased this much, versus the value above that you could arguably say has resulted in you completing that project? Have you ever tried to make that calculation or speak to that at all?
We have not made that calculation yet. Really, the value increase, I would suspect at this point, is attributed to some of the zoning changes and some construction. There hasn't been as much development in what was the undeveloped area yet. Just as we were working with the property owner, COVID hit, and so their plans for continued development in the area slowed down significantly. They had other areas where they were building homes and making some commercial developments. So those have continued, but this specific area slowed down a little bit. I don't know that we would have enough information yet that would allow us to make a robust analysis, but certainly that's something that we can take a look at. I think that's a good point to make to our council. You see, I see another question. Are there utility services in all these larger sections of land? Not in all of the larger sections of land. What we did was work with the HR MUD, which provides water and wastewater, and we made sure that we provided taps so that as the development occurs, the roadway does not have to be cut up. So that was coordinated as part of the design. The other utilities, the electric utility worked some also with the designer to provide the major lines that they needed to along the roadway. So while not all of the area has the utilities, there are stub outs so that it'll be easier for them to develop once they do start building. We had some slides on the adoption process that I'm happy to go through. These were presented to the council at the time that the TRZ was adopted, and if you'd like, I'm happy to go through them.
Terry, rather than going through the process, maybe you could just speak to the effort involved to convince. I mean, maybe it was easy. Maybe it was, hey, this is another source of funding. Okay, great, let's do it. Or was there some skepticism that you had to overcome? Was there, where was the challenge, if any, in the process of getting a TRZ formed and adopted? Maybe it was in that, well, who's going to be managing this? I'm sure you have limited staff in a small city that you're in, small town.
Absolutely. I think the key was that it was part of a larger plan, and the town, I mean, you saw the splits on the finances. We had a champion. We continue to have Alderman Miller on council who understood the TRZ and has been a member of the Transportation Policy Board at the MPO for a number of years. So it was key to have a policy champion for the project. The town recognizes that it cannot, and certainly now it's become even more acute, that it cannot annex. So developing areas that are within the town was very important to the council. And they recognized that this was one way of developing those areas, creating the value that they needed within the town. Even though they were mortgaging part of that growth, right? So they understood the value. One of the factors that made it somewhat of an easier sell is that one of the major property owners, we had to deal with 3 property owners to acquire all of the right-of-way for the roadway, and the major property owner donated all of the right-of-way. Now you could make the argument that they would have had to donate the right-of-way and build the roadway, similar to the question that we discussed earlier today. But it wasn't even a question. It was not a battle. When the town approached them, we told them what the plan was and how we were part of a larger plan and how that opened up all of their property. It was not an issue, and so they donated all of the right-of-way, and they also agreed to enter into a 30-year maintenance agreement with the town for median and the shared bike path maintenance. So the cleanup, all the maintenance for the landscaping is running on their nickel and not on the town's nickel. So I don't want to make it seem like it was a perfect honeymoon, but it certainly had a lot of very positive factors that made it easier to convince the council that this was going to be something favorable for the town. The challenge was in developing the agreement, because we were dealing with 3 governmental entities: the RMA, the county, and Horizon City. There was some concern at the county that they were dedicating a large portion of funds to a roadway within a municipality. But I think that, again, we had a strong advocate at the county commissioner's court, and Commissioner Perez, and so he was able to champion the project. So that's one of the recommendations that I would make, is that you have not just staff advocates for the project that have really done their homework as far as the financial analysis and making sure that the project is a good fit for TRZ funding, and thinking about funding mechanisms, and thinking about who's going to manage the project for you, depending on the resources of the community. But also making sure that you have champions at the policy level who also understand value capture, who understand how the project fits into the overall plan for the community.
Terry?
Yes, sir.
We just have a few minutes left. I don't know if you want to open it up for questions, but if that's okay, I want to say thank you very much for you taking your time. I mean, this is fantastic that you were able to give us this time out of your schedule to share your experience with us. I hope this is the beginning maybe of a correspondence we can have and continue to get your thoughts. And if there's anything we can help with your creation of a TRZ or anything else down here in Laredo, we would love to participate and return the favor any way we can. But thank you very much for your time today. For those that are here, we've got about 10 minutes left. If there are any questions, is there anybody that would like to unmute? And Matt, you can go ahead and unmute if you want and ask those questions.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, as this moves into the next kind of phase of this, how you're dealing with sort of the risk management / asset management considerations that go along with this, and kind of as part of the responsibility to the other entities that also invested in this, and also ensuring that value capture is actually meeting expectations.
That's a good question, because we are dealing with some maintenance issues. We've been working with the RMA, and we expected a 1 year, and we received a 1 year maintenance warranty, right, from the construction after the city accepted the project, and that was accepted, as I said, in October of 2018. So we went through 2019. The city accepted the project for maintenance, so it is a city roadway. The city will be responsible for any future maintenance to make sure that it is in acceptable condition. Because it was more of vacant land, and we had, we looked at the financial analysis completed, and we did not take the highest performing scenario. We looked at the mid scenario, again, to take a more conservative approach. There wasn't anything built into the agreement as far as the town using best efforts or any kind of requirement that bound the town into fostering growth. I think it goes back to the general expectation, because the town is committed to paying down that debt, its proportionate share. If the TRZ does not perform as expected, the town will have to make up those payments from its general fund. So certainly it's in the town's best interest to work through its planning department, to work through its economic development corporation to foster that growth. And as I said, just as we were getting more into the development of that entire area and working with the property owner, COVID hit, so everything was kind of put on hold. But we're looking at the comprehensive plan that the town just updated, and we've been working with the stakeholders in that area so that they know the kind of development that we like to foster. Certainly at some of the intersections between East Lake Boulevard and some of the other roadways that will ultimately be built, again, to create that increment. I don't know if that helps to answer the question.
No, definitely. Thank you. And yeah, the EDC, calling out the kind of the reaching through the EDCs to sort of think through future investments and that mixed use commercial kind of, you're trying to get at different zoning elements along the road to increase the value. It's is there anything that you're looking at as far as connections to I-10 that further improvements down the road that are going to be kind of as part of this or required as part of this?
No, we don't have any frontage. The town doesn't have any frontage to I-10, so all we can hope to do is provide other connections. And we're working with the Texas Department of Transportation on Horizon Boulevard. That's a farm to market road. They've done a corridor study, but we're not looking at the TRZ funding that at this point. I think we're taking a very conservative approach, and the town is just trying to foster growth in that area so that it can get out from under the debt and get that funding back into the general fund. But certainly the town continues to have an appetite for value capture because, as I said, they are looking at a TIRZ.
Any other questions for Ms. Quezada? Well, again, Terry, thank you so much, and try out that taco shop, Jerry's, if you get the chance.
I will, and I look forward when we can perhaps meet and face to face. I think that you all had great energy. I appreciate your attention and all of your questions. Thank you very much.
That'd be fantastic. We'd love to bring you down to Laredo and maybe do a presentation like this in person as we bring this discussion to our policy committee members in the MPO and our council members and commission members in the city and county. So again, thank you, Terry, and thank you everybody for participating today. We will make a copy of this video, put up on YouTube, and it'll be there for you if you want to watch again or if you want to share it with those you think it would be helpful. Thank you everybody for your time and attention. I hope everyone has a great weekend, and if I don't see you until then, happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.